visitors.
Okay.
Let me do the introduction. So I think Allan doesn't really require an introduction. Allan belongs to a special club of celebrities, together with Phil and a few others that everyone in the SAS world seems to know. So Allan working as a director for SAS apps at Analytium, and Allan going to be talking to us about the SASjs, open source framework designed specifically to develop applications that sit on top of SAS. Allan, over to you.
Thank you. I just need to find the share screen button. Got it. Okay, yep, SASjs, DevOps with SASjs. At any point, I'll probably be talking quite fast because there's a lot of content, but feel free to interrupt or put a message in the chat and I can expand on a particular point. The thing about SASjs, which is kind of a bit different to maybe the way you're used to working with SAS, is that everything in SASjs works locally on your own laptop. And this is how we call SASjs Git native, in that you push and pull to your repository from your own checkout, your own clone of a Git repository, and then you compile and build your project locally. And then when you need to execute or deploy, that's the point at which you actually push it to SAS. And I'll come on to how that works. Full screen. So why would you choose SASjs? First of all, it's open source, MIT open source. So there's no restrictions. You can use it to build products. You can use it for anything you like. It's cross-platform, which means that we focus mainly on Viya currently, but we're also expanding support for SAS 9 with metadata. And also a lot of the tools also work just the same if you're using desktop-based SAS. And it's actively developed. You can see that from the commits on GitHub, and supported by Analytium, Analytium being Microsoft and SAS Silver partners. Why use SASjs? So I've just mentioned the ability to use Git native SAS project workflows, compile, build locally, deploy remotely. It's also self-documenting in that the way that we have an opinion on how to set up a project, and part of that opinion is the headers you put in your SAS files, and I'll come on to how the documentation is generated. And another thing the framework enables is test-driven development, that you can actually write the tests before you build your SAS jobs and services. Again, I'll come on to that. So where might you use SASjs? Well, locally in VS Code or whichever IDE you prefer. Because of the command line interface, you can also stick it in Jenkins or any scheduling system, or even as part of a pipeline in Bitbucket or GitLab, or an action, which is the GitHub equivalent. You could also run these commands as part of a Git hook. So maybe before you make a commit, you could run a code quality linting command. The background for SASjs is web apps, JavaScript, but it's also really useful on data engineering and data science projects, in that it provides you that structure so you can get started quickly and focusing on delivering business value. There's 3 parts to the framework. These are all independent. You can use them on their own, but when you combine them, they're a real accelerator. I'll go into what they are. There's the SASjs core. It's a macro library, about 150 macros and growing, which cover, there's macro functions, macros procedures, metadata macros, Viya macros. There's some Lua in there. And if you want to get these macros into your local repository, you just run npm install at SASjs core. The adapter is it's a JavaScript library written in TypeScript, and this handles the authentication and all of the communication between the SAS platforms and your client. And you can install that with npm install at SASjs adapter, or you can also use a CDN. And then what we'll be focusing on most in this session is the command line interface, the CLI. And this gives you an opinionated setup of a project, and also all the tooling for all the DevOps. You can install this locally, but we recommend you install globally so that you can use it anywhere, not just inside your project. More on the SAS side now. Before we move forward, it's worth thinking about what is a SAS file. So we identify 3 primary types of SAS file. The first one being a job, and a job has data inputs, data outputs. The second type is a service, and the big difference between a service and a job is that a web service typically outputs JSON. So we pre-insert some macros to enable you to send the JSON back. And then there's tests, and tests are really just services, but in a different folder, designed to use with SASjs test. So of those three service types, or sorry, SAS file types, there's also supporting SAS files, and those being macros and includes. A macro is really easy to insert in a job or a service or a test because you can just put the definition at the beginning of the file. Whereas an include, this is kind of a free-form SAS program, and you can't just copy paste that into a file because you need to have some control over when you run it. So what we do with includes is we wrap it in put statements to a file ref, and that way you can include that file ref anywhere in your job. And I'll come on to show you how that's done. Some more of the lingo in SASjs, two important bits are the app lock, the location, and this is the folder in SAS drive or metadata under which the app actually gets deployed to. And then there's the target. This is an important concept because your project, your local project repository, you might have multiple targets. Maybe you're building an app that deploys to both SAS 9 and to Viya, or maybe you've got a project and that deploys to a dev and a test and a production environment. Each of those will be a different target. They might have the same server URL, but they've probably got maybe a different app lock or a different server type. The first command then we'll look at is SASjs create. So you run this SASjs create command, you give it a name of a folder, it'll create this folder, and then T for template, and you can choose like an Angular, a React web app, or a minimal web app, or even just a jobs project, which contains jobs. That project will be structured according to the settings inside the SASjs config file. And again, I'll come on to that. So this is a screenshot. You can see at the top, I ran SASjs create my app, and that created a folder called my app with all of these files and folders. I've got a DB folder, and that is where we say you should put your DDL and your data lines, the definition for your data libraries. There's an includes folder for freeform SAS programs. There's a jobs for jobs, macros for macros. Node modules is used for any third-party dependencies defined in this package.json, and this is an NPM setup. This is the way NPM works. You define all your dependencies here, and they get saved here. So the SASjs core and SASjs adapter would get stored here. The SASjs folder has all the config and then tests for any tests. So once you've created your app and you've got your local instance with that structure, the one you've just installed has no concept of your SAS environment. And that's where you'd run SASjs add, and that will add a target that is relative to you. So you can see at the top, I run the SASjs add command, and there's all these prompts. So I say, is it SAS 9 or Viya? Give it an alias, give it a folder app lock, put the server location in there. If it's Viya, you can add a client and secret, and then click the link to get the authorization code, and that will let the CLI interface with the Viya REST APIs. And that's it. You're all connected, ready to go. You can already run SASjs run, and that lets you execute arbitrary SAS code, for instance. You can also run SASjs doc, and this makes use of Doxygen and the program headers to generate HTML documentation for your project. It looks a bit like this. You can see there's code formatting, parameters. Also, it generates data lineage. So if you put the data inputs and data outputs in each of your jobs, it will generate this graph, and you can click on the job names, and it'll take you to the definition for that job. So this is really helpful to really understand the data flow in your project. And all of this is driven from the headers in your SAS programs. This is the Doxygen format. You have these at details, at file. Everything here is just markdown. So things like 2 hashes is a heading 2 heading. You can indent 4 spaces and have a code section. On line 23, you can see I've defined some SAS macros. And this is the part that the CLI will look at when we do the compile. So the compile will look at next, and it reads the headers, extracts the macros and the includes, and then uses that list to compile the job. And then here on 29 and 32, the data inputs and data outputs, this is what's used to generate that diagram, the data lineage diagram. So that describes the individual job or service or test. What about the project itself? The great thing about the SASjs config JSON file, so any SASjs project that you pick up, you can go straight away to the SASjs config file and know immediately where everything is and how it fits together, because it contains all the configuration for the project. So for instance, .config will say where the docs get published to, what the logo is, what the description is. Test config will show the init program, the turb program, any macro variables. Same for job config, deploy config. The thing to remember, or the thing to be aware of when you're configuring your SASjs config, is that you've got root level, which is the immediate part of the JSON, and then target level. So you see at the bottom, I've got a target defined, a Viya target. I can also put a .config and a test config in my target, and that will override the root level. So anything you put at root level applies to all targets, and anything you put in a target just applies to that target. So for instance, for a Viya target, you might have some Viya macros that only relate to that target. So that's the target. So coming back now to the compilation process, at this point, it's worth putting out of your head any thought of a compiled macro library, because that's not what this does. SASjs compile takes all of the macros dependencies and sticks them as pre-code in an output. And the output is one file per job or service or test. If you come from a background of SAS, you're probably used to having a SAS autos and sticking all of your macros in directory systems. And the benefit of that is that you just have one definition of the macro that everything uses. The not so good benefit, or the argument away from that, is that if you change that macro, then all the jobs that you might not expect to have changed are going to be changed. And also, how do you promote? You can't just give somebody a copy of a job. You have to also give them the entire file system almost for them to run the job. So whereas this approach, where everything is self-contained, every job contains all of the dependencies, you could just email someone that job and they could run it. So it's more robust in that sense. You can define init and term programs that go before and after the job. You can define macro variables. So maybe you have different macro variables for different environments. I've just seen a message come in the chat. Hi, Angus. Hi, Stefan. Yeah, so compilation is the process of creating one file per job or service or test. And when we say one file, that file gets created in a temporary folder called SASjs build. So you can see here, I've created some services in subfolders, and these are the self-contained files. Now, how do I get all of these files up to my target, my SAS9 or Viya target? Maybe I've got dozens or hundreds of these files. The next step then is to create a build pack. Now, the build process takes all of those individual files and creates a JSON file and a SAS program. The JSON file is a piece of JSON that contains all of the jobs and services and tests. And if you've got a client and a secret, then you can immediately just promote or use that to deploy in Viya. But if you don't have a client or secret, maybe an admin hasn't given you one, or you're on SAS9, we also generate a SAS program. And if you run that SAS program will create all of the jobs and services and tests. So you could either copy paste that into Enterprise Guide and run it, or maybe you could SSH and % include it as a stored process. There's different ways you could use, but the SAS program is a fallback. So then, yeah, the deploy process then is about loading the JSON if you have the client secret, or running the SAS program. This deploy scripts section, you can define shell scripts to run locally as part of a deploy, or SAS programs. If it's a SAS program here, it runs remotely. If it's a shell script, it runs locally. And that's the end-to-end process of getting code from your local Git repository up to your SAS server. And you can do all 3 steps in one by running SASjs CBD, compile, build, deploy. Now that all of your code is on the SAS server as jobs or as stored processes in SAS 9, there's some additional commands you can use to execute them. So SASjs job execute will execute a single job. SASjs flow you can configure that with an input JSON to run waves of jobs with dependencies and capture all of the logs and the statuses in a CSV file. SASjs request is for running web requests, so that will capture the JSON response. And then SASjs test. So a test in SASjs is when we take a macro, a job, or a service, and all we have to do, it's really simple. You just change the suffix instead of being .sas to .test.sas. Or if you want to have multiple tests for that artifact, you can have .test.1.sas or test.2.sas. And when that project is compiled, all of those tests are moved to the test folder. There's a coverage shown, so you can see how many macros have got tests for them. And you can execute them all with just one command, SASjs test. That takes a JSON file as input, so you can modify that to change the order of the tests. Or if you just want to run, say, a particular folder or a particular test, just type SASjs test and then some string, and then it'll filter the tests just for that test. We've got examples of assertion macros in core, so that will automatically generate the output with pass or fail for you. And another nice thing about this approach is that because every test is a stored process or a job, it's easy to rerun. You can just click the URL and rerun that test in its own session. JUnit XML that's going to be ready in the next couple of days. So you can get the results in JSON, CSV, and very soon in JUnit XML. Also on the terminal output. So this is something we use a lot now, SASjs test, and whenever I'm adding a new feature to an application, I try and make sure I've got a test for that for every service. So SASjs test will test your code after it's been deployed. But wouldn't it be nice if you could stop problems before it gets deployed? And that's what SASjs lint does. So this is built to catch common issues. Examples we've got so far is max line length, no nested macros, no spaces in file names. You can turn all of these on or off in this SASjs lint config. Does the macro end statement have the macro name? And the great thing about this check is you can run it as part of a pre-commit hook. So that prevents you from pushing these problems to the repository in the first place. We also use it in the VS Code extension. So I'll just flip to that and open a macro. So you see here, it's also listed in my problems. I've got a macro end statement without macro name. So all I have to do is right click, format document. There's the macro name. If I change the macro name, I can do the same thing. Other things this checks is things like if I've got an embedded password, I've got an error here. It takes me to the line number. Yeah, we've got a load of checks like that. So to wrap it kind of cohesively then, the title is DevOps with SAS. So a DevOps workflow using SASjs would look something like this. You do a git clone, you check out your own feature branch locally on your machine. You make some changes, you run SASjs CBD to compile those changes and push them to a personal target. Maybe that's a folder in SAS Drive that's just for you, so you can test your changes. You then run SASjs test and check the results. You're happy with the results, so you do a git add and a git commit. And then as part of that git commit, the SASjs lint runs, so you can be sure all the coding standards are applied. And then everything's fine. So you do a git push, you do the git push, and then your GitLab pipeline will run, it'll do a build, it'll run the tests, and then whoever reviews the merge request can look at the results of those tests and be happy about doing the merge. And then once it's merged to master, then there's another pipeline which will also deploy. Maybe it'll deploy to a shared target, the production target, and then also update the documentation. We've built some other commands. I think we've got about 20 odd commands now. So commands to create Viya contexts, to manage Viya folders, to service package the deployment process. But we've also got some additional stuff coming soon. And the one I'm really excited about is the SAS 9 support. So we've been doing a lot of in-depth work with SAS Logon, and well, it's basically working. We just haven't wrapped it up and pushed it yet. But what this is going to enable is the ability to use the CLI on SAS 9. So you could do a SASjs run some SAS code and run the code in SAS 9. And yes, we will add that to the VS Code extension. And that will work also for job execute, for request, for test. So there will be no need for SSH. You can literally just use SASjs run and then run some SAS code on SAS 9 from the command line. And we're also building base SAS support for web apps. So what this is going to enable is things like our data controller product to push that out to Office Analytics customers if you've just got desktop base SAS. But the underlying tooling there will also be on GitHub. So what that means is you can build web apps for base SAS, desktop SAS customers in a way that will also work the same for SAS 9 and for Viya. And we're also making some improvements to streaming apps. And the streaming apps we already support. The nice thing about that is you can deploy an app to Viya or SAS 9 without a web server. And we do that by putting all the web content into metadata folders or SAS Drive. So if you like this stuff, you think it's useful and you'd like to support us, the best way to support us would be to engage our stuff. Data Controller is a business data capture tool. It's free for 5 users. SAS 9 Health is an assessment. We've got a desktop app that can analyze a metadata organization, or a SAS 9 metadata, analyze it for 100 different checks. And do a report on that for you. We've got Zabbix performance monitoring. So this is an open source monitoring setup that can check the performance of your SAS platform. SAS 9 REST API is another tool we've got. Might be interesting for you. Our team is made up of SAS app developers. So if you need help building an interface onto SAS 9, we're available. And maybe if you're using SASjs and there's some feature that you'd like to see, you can engage us and we can add that for you. So that's it. You can go to the GitHub site. All of our stuff's there. Any questions?
I think Angus asked about the dot at the end of macro names, but other people, I think, answered that. I got a question for you about the projects. Could you describe any projects where commercial projects where SASjs has already been used, and if you could put it in a context of the value it brought to that particular project?
Yes, I can't mention the customer, but the project involved, it was a Viya project. There was a team of about 7 different developers. And in the beginning, there was what was happening was everybody was writing their SAS code in SAS Drive. And then there was no real kind of version control. People were creating like version 1, version 2, version 3. There was different versions of like a percent run all running around, and it was kind of scattered, and there was no code reviews or anything like that. Now, what SASjs enabled on that project was that suddenly we could bring everything into enterprise GitHub instance. Everybody started working on their own Git clones, and then everyone could test their results. It was very clear what was running with SASjs flow, and all code began to be reviewed before it got pushed to the shared environment. So it really enabled 7 developers to work in parallel and massively increase the transparency of what was getting pushed to SAS.
Okay. So brought order to a large scale project.
Yes.
Okay. Do you think certain use cases for SAS app, are there certain use cases that are really good for SAS apps and others where it isn't relevant for SASjs, or do you think it can be applied to any project in any industry?
So it's really relevant if you're writing SAS code, base SAS code. So if you're playing with the Viya APIs and more in the CAS APIs and the action sets, it's less relevant. But if you're working in Spree, then it's definitely relevant. And it's the same for Pharma. Maybe you're just working with desktop SAS, but there's some parts here like the SASjs doc, which could help to document your project, and also the compile build part or the compile part that gives you standalone programs that you can share and know for sure that if you run this program again, it will give you the same results. But if the data is the same, obviously, you don't have to share an entire file system.
Okay. Has anyone got any questions?
Ricardo says, do you only test examples that you're able to show? Sure. So if I go to the macro core library, for instance, I've got tests here. So what am I testing? I'm testing a macro function where I get a list of variables. So up here, I do test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I get using various options. I then use some data step logic to say whether it's a pass or a fail. And then I basically, this test results table gets sent back as part of a test term. So I open the JSON, send the test results table, close. Here's another one. I'm doing an assertion macro here. So I'm saying, do these values match? If so, the test is a pass. And to give you an example of the results, if I go to GitHub or library, and then just look at one of the recent pushes. So yeah, here's the example of the console output. And to give you an example of all the test results go into a SASjs results folder. So here's a CSV that has the link to the test. So I could click that and rerun that test. And there's also a JSON file with all the test results. And to run that, I just type SASjs test. That's it.
Thank you, Ricardo, for the question. Daniel says, I love what you, Allan, doing. What does it take for one to do the same kind of programming?
Well, I'm very fortunate to have a team of very talented JavaScript and TypeScript developers. So I wouldn't recommend that you necessarily go down that path, because I mean, the whole point of building these tooling using TypeScript is to help you build your SAS projects faster. So yeah, the goal of this is to help you write SAS. But obviously, we'd love help building this tooling. But yeah.
Yeah, like what you said, Allan, because it's available on GitHub, anyone, including you, Daniel, can contribute. So it's just a matter of joining the repository. Probably don't use the terminology right. Fork, clone, merge request, and the team will implement it in. And Allan, correct me if I'm wrong, for the new features, if there is a commercial support available for this, but also if someone needs a feature and that to be accelerated by your team, that's also an option, and that's available for free and the paid options as well, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So say maybe you want some additional validations done as part of SASjs lint, or you'd like to see some new features in Viya or in SAS 9, yeah, you can talk to us about that. If you go to SAS apps, you can contact me directly, but also on the SAS apps page, there's a contact.
Okay, we are almost out of time. Anyone else for anything else? That doesn't look like we have any more questions. Well, Allan, thank you very much. It's been a very good presentation, very interesting, very engaging. Love to see the innovation of this kind. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Just wanted to add a few more words before everyone goes. Oh, I have a very loud, noisy motorcycle there. This presentation has been recorded and will be shared on a YouTube. Will be shared on a YouTube and our channels. The links will be posted everywhere, including LinkedIn and the others. But next event, the Suzuki event, we have Don Henderson, which some of you know, and Paul Dorfman, a colleague of his, that's going to be joining to us from the US. It will be really early for them. They very kindly agreed to keep the same timing, first Thursday lunchtime, our UK time. And they will be presenting their SAS Global Forum presentation using hash functions to partition data into independent groups. So sounds interesting, and I hope to see some of you, if not most of you, next Suzuki event on the 1st of July. Thank you very much.